Hello, and welcome to another episode of Immigration and Mobility Decoded. I am Eric, and thank you all for tuning in today. My co host Finn is out for the week, so we just have a brief episode intro with myself before we hop into our conversation with some folks from a company called Labormex, Gideon Cooper and Lydia Hock. Labormex specializes in helping companies navigate and secure H-2B and H-2A visas here in the United States. Great conversation with them, and everyone will hear that in a few short moments. But first, I just wanted to provide a quick overview of some recent headlines regarding immigration and mobility. I'll include a link to these articles in the show notes below or wherever you're listening so you can all take a look and see what's happening around the world. But first, as always, if you are not subscribed yet, and whether you're listening on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, definitely would appreciate follow, a subscribe, all that good stuff. Just helps us keep the show growing and helps us build the audience and ensure that people in immigration and mobility are finding the show and staying up to date with everything that is going on. So first things first, just a couple of headlines. Last week, Reuters reported that the German government passed a draft bill that aims to ease requirements under the country's nationality laws in order to provide a fast track pathway to citizenship and attract skilled migrant workers. As we know, the German government has made it a priority this year and recent months to really overhaul their immigration system. Like a lot of countries, Germany is starting to see and experience some demographic changes that, if they don't take action, they will see the impacts. Among those changes or things that they're looking to tackle is a labor shortage. They have a lot of workers retiring and they need individuals to replace those job openings. And so that the government there is making strides to revamp, in a way, its immigration system to make it easier for individuals to come into the country of Germany to, secure a work permit. And I believe there's even talk of also updating the system so then individuals can secure long term living and working permits throughout the country. Elsewhere, Gallup recent poll says that Americans remain largely supportive of U.S. immigration. Majorities say that it is good for the country and they prefer to see immigration kept at its present level or increased rather than decreased. About two-thirds of Americans consider immigration a good thing, while 27% consider it a bad thing. And largely, as one might expect, this tends to fall along partisan divides. And, depending on an individual's political leaning, they might view immigration as they would rather see an increase versus decrease. But overall, according to this Gallup poll, the country is more positive toward immigration than it was in the 1990s and early 2000s. And that is a perfect segue to a new article from Axios the headline reads: Immigrants are rescuing a worker starved U.S. economy. Axios reports that immigrants are joining the U.S. workforce at much higher levels than normal, and they're likely to account for roughly 500,000 new jobs over the next 3 quarters, according to Goldman Sachs. As everyone knows, the labor market remains historically tight as we all continue to emerge from the pandemic era. And employers are turning to immigrants to fill those job openings. Further in this Axios article, the immigrant labor force between January 2020 and July of 2023 has grown by 9.5%. And then compare that to the 1.5% growth rate among the native born, according to Axios. And a lot of this is driven by immigration. Axios writes the rate at which the US is giving out visas, both temporary work and permanent green cards, has risen by about 335,000 workers per year over the past 12 months. We're seeing this near record highs. And they further report that the government has successfully begun to clear the backlog of more than 500,000 visa applications that built up over the course of the pandemic. And many of these immigrants are working and they are replacing workers here in the US that are retiring. Many of them, of those workers that are retiring, belong to the boomer generation. And that's kind of the story around the world. I just mentioned it in Germany. We're seeing it here in the US, and other countries are looking to fill those worker shortages as older populations are starting to retire. So that's all for the headlines for this week. Very excited for everyone to hear our conversation with Lydia Hock and Gideon Cooper, both from Labormex. And that is coming up right now.
And welcome to another episode of Immigration and Mobility Decoded. I am Eric, and joining me today is my co-host Finn, and we are so excited to welcome our two guests, Lydia Hock and Gideon Cooper. Lydia and Gideon, how are you both doing today?
We're good. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, fantastic. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, definitely excited to chat more. Both of you are part of an organization known as Labormex. We will dive into the organization and the work that you guys do in just a few minutes. But Lydia and Gideon, we like to always, just welcome our guests and, kind of do some small talk first. And, just want to, how's the summer going for both of you? Lydia, I think you just came back from a European trip. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah, we went to France and Turkey and Spain. So yeah,
Nice.
amazing tour.
Have you been there before?
Yes. Yeah, we
And,
try to go every summer if we can,
nice.
for sure.
Do you notice any differences, like the more times you go, or do you feel like more like you find those hidden gems, or like you just have your favorite spots, or anything like that?
I think now we have our favorite spots for sure. Yeah, definitely.
Nice. Gideon, how about you? You're out in the western part of the states, is that right?
Yeah, North Idaho, so probably about an hour drive from Canada. Really close between Washington State and then Montana as well. So I got into a little fun. Had some family from Fort Collins, Colorado, come up to Missoula for a little visit. So we drove over there, had a little barbecue, and had some good family reunion time. So that was really enjoyable.
Nice. Are you the grill master when it comes to barbecuing?
I spend quite a bit of time in the kitchen. Absolutely, it's really nice. I'm still getting into the smoking life. Haven't quite mastered that, but pretty good on the grill otherwise.
Nice. You have to share some tips and tricks. I'm not a grill master at all. What's your like? I guess your preferred. How'd you get into it? Like what do you like, and where do you go to just like learn more?
Well, honestly, I started years ago at a buddy of the Army when I was stationed in Italy on active duty. My roommate was, prior to joining the military, he went to culinary arts school. So he really taught me a lot about just the basics of cooking and kind of inspired me to spend more time in the kitchen. So since then, it's just really been a endeavor to invest my time in. It's where I do 90% of the cooking around the house between me and my wife, which is really nice. And honestly, on any given day, I could come up with just about anything, but I love to do like ribs and tri-tip on the smoker. It's one of my favorite go-to meals. Really simple and super tasty. It goes with just about anything you want to pair it with. So,
sounds delicious. Lydia, you're in Miami and you moved there from Texas. Obviously, a huge barbecue scene in Texas. What's your favorite barbecue dish or just things to eat?
Oh gosh, that's kind of tough. I do like my ribs for sure. I think those are my favorite. But you can't go wrong anywhere you go in Texas, honestly, for barbecue.
Totally. Finn, you got any favorite barbecue dishes?
I mean, we're not well known for it up here in Maine. Barbecue and seafood don't go so well together. But yeah, I'm doing a road trip through the South this summer, and I'm definitely planning on stopping in Kansas City, some other hot spots to grab some roadside barbecue.
Nice.
Honestly, hearing Gideon talk about his grilling process just makes me want to go out to the patio right now and start grilling.
Yeah, get that early lunch.
I'll trade you some crab cakes for some ribs any day. So
That sounds good. Yeah.
Nice. Awesome. Well, Lydia and Gideon, we'll hop into kind of the core content for today. Just starting, talking to both of you about the H-2A and the H-2B visas. Which are two employment-based visas here in the U.S. So I'm going to turn it over to Finn to dive into that.
Yeah, I mean, some folks in our audience might be familiar with the H-2A and H-2B visa programs, but given that you're both the experts on those particular programs, I was just sort of hoping you could give a summary of maybe the origin of that visa program, why there was a need in the first place in the U.S. For that visa, and then exactly what the visas are intended for. So, who's using them, which employers are utilizing them, and what types of workers are coming over on the H-2A and H-2B visa. So. Lydia, I can start with you, and you can pass it off to Gideon if you want.
If I'm not mistaken, I think this started in the 80s, and correct me if I'm wrong, Gideon. It was like the braceros, right? And then it evolved, but there was always kind of a need for guest workers, right? We've always had that need. We still have that need, and I honestly think that this program doesn't get a good enough attention because it would solve a lot of problems that we have right now. And it is a great program. It's not perfect, but it allows people to come in seasonally or temporarily to the US. They do their work, they save their money, and then they go home to their families. And then every year, the idea is for them to be able to come back. So that's kind of.
yeah,
And the distinction. Go ahead, Gideon.
well, I was just saying, yeah, absolutely. With points to what Lydia was saying, I mean, for the longest time we had a huge migration of workers that would come up, through the West, and they'd migrate all the way across the U.S. and then over time, it was a good system for the most part, but at the same token, a lot of employers that would miss out just because they wouldn't be being touched by those workforces on a seasonal nature. They still needed a workforce to complete their harvesting needs, especially considering, where with respect to Lydia, outside of her, everyone else is kind of in the north part of the U.S. I mean, it's a totally different climate than the southern states where a lot of these migrant workers would travel to. So the H-2 program really helped fill some of those gaps that normally we wouldn't be able to find an adequate workforce to properly harvest crops.
Yeah, and it's interesting that there was an organic economic need for seasonal workers, like you mentioned. This was always happening throughout history, and in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the government decided to put some structure around it, and that is the culmination of these programs. So there's this distinction between the H-2A, which is for agricultural workers, and then H-2B, which is for other types of seasonal workers. So maybe starting with the H-2A, Gideon. What types of employers are utilizing the H-2A visa to bring in workers? Is it big farms, small farms? Is it agricultural, or food processing plants? What types of employers are using it?
So the H-2A, and I can speak especially to this because I used to file petitions for another agency a couple of years ago prior to coming to Labormex, and it was really neat being part of that, seeing all the different farms. So we represented a lot of smaller farms at that time. Since then, through just hearing some of the different dynamics of how the program has changed in the last even 5 years, almost 50% of the applications coming through are farm labor contractors. So the farm labor contractors go out to these farms. They say, hey, we'll provide you with the workforce you need, and we'll handle all the payroll, the transportation, the housing. Basically, you just pay us, and we're going to get your crops harvested and take care of all the agricultural needs. So a big portion now is, like I said, it's about 50% farm labor contractors versus individual single site growers. Now, there are some larger entities involved, but for the most part, there's still a lot of individual farmers that represent the whole of the H-2A program currently in the U.S.
Lydia, I remember reading, I think the Wall Street Journal did a spread on the H-2A visa program a few years ago, and they talked about all of the food waste that can occur at harvesting season on American farms because there just simply isn't enough labor to pick the produce at the time of harvesting. How crucial, how essential is the H-2A visa program for, like Gideon mentioned, for farmers to hire out these contractors to come in for these seasonal sort of, crucial parts of our agricultural system?
I mean, we need the labor. There's absolutely no doubt. If we don't, then we're literally going to be getting all of our fruits and vegetables from China or somewhere else. Like, I mean, I don't see any way around it. These are so difficult, these jobs. Being on the field for that many hours, I don't think anybody wants to do these jobs, right? So I really don't think that there's a better program, especially when if you travel to Mexico and you see the way that how different. I'm sorry. Can we start over?
Yeah, just take a few
Yeah.
seconds and then
Okay.
then you hop back into it.
Okay. Can you ask the question again, Finn? Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember how I phrased it. Essentially, we were just talking about the seasonal component of H2A of the H2A visa program, and how there are certain times, throughout throughout the farming cycle where harvesting requires a lot more labor than maybe other times, right? And how important those harvesting seasons are to have the labor available to pick that produce. Otherwise, it all goes to waste, right?
Yeah, exactly. Talking for so many years with so many employers and so many farmers, without a solution like an H2A or a program, I mean, the fruit is going to rot, the vegetables are going to rot, and we're going to literally end up getting fruit and vegetables from other countries. So we really need to promote this program.
And I feel then there's another side effect of the rotting fruits and vegetables is that it wouldn't that likely increase prices in the grocery stores for everyone else, and so it creates this cycle of higher prices and, like you said, having to import food from other countries. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And these are very hard jobs. And for example, I'm bicultural. I lived half of my life in Mexico, half of my life in the US. I lived for a few years on a ranch in Mexico. So I knew a lot of the local workers. We had a mango orchard and an orange orchard and other crops. And I saw what they did day to day and I saw how much money they could make. And it was really nothing. So for them to come to the States and to have, you know, their wages go up by 100%. I mean, that's huge for these workers, and the conditions are even better obviously in the US than they are in Mexico, so it really is a win-win.
Yeah, and you mentioned the fact that there isn't a domestic labor force willing to do this work, right? We saw that during the COVID-19 pandemic when a lot of international travel was shut down, and there were stories of again produce just being left in the fields to rot. There just wasn't enough labor to actually step into the American food system. So I think it's one important thing to point out that immigration regulations, the immigration system, it really impacts the price of food at the grocery store. That's how rooted it is in our system. Gideon, I'm curious, are some of the uh, what are some of the most common scenarios you see where employers require these H2A workers, right? Like, if at what point does an employer or a farm or some sort of company related to the agricultural system get to the point where they need these H2A laborers over using machines, robots, or domestic labor?
Um, quite, Finn, quite honestly, in a lot of situations, it just comes down to examining your organization or your farm, determining, where your labor shortages are at. So, I mean, even if you're a small fixed sites term, as they would use in the program, fixed site employer, essentially, you own and operate your own farm. You might get to a point where maybe your family has moved on. So, for instance, I was a recruiter for the Army out in Kansas. A lot of agricultural out in Kansas, huge fields. A lot of the kids, back in 2014, were wanting to get away from the family farming. They wanted to do something different with their life. They wanted to go to college. They wanted to move out of the state. They'd never been anywhere else. So these generation long farms that have basically been using their families years after years to help manage the farms are now losing out on their own family workforce. So that opens the door for them to hire more people. Well, then in turn, it's like, where are you going to get those folks? Because a lot of the kids their age are doing the same thing. They're going to school. They're trying to get work jobs in the city. So that takes away from opportunities out in the the harvesting season, things of that nature. So there's a lot of lot of kids that just walked away from the farming industry, and they don't want to take it on from their parents. So that opened the door for these farms to look for additional workforces. And then on top of that, agricultural has consistently grown in the last 20 years. It's huge in the U.S. We provide a lot of different crops and things throughout the world. And so as we have grown, that need for labor has grown. But again, we've seen a decline in the workforce that actually wants to participate. And then also because of the government cracking down on basically the migration of the workers, all the issues at the border, it's really stem the flow of how many people can actually come in and take on those seasonal jobs. So at that point, it really is just allowed for this program to grow to where farmers, not in a sense, are forced to use it, but it's really one of the only legal options they can use to supplement their workforce, especially when there are workers that just don't want to take on these jobs anymore.
Yeah, it seems like a last resort, to be honest with you. Like it's such a difficult program to go through, and it's expensive. So the way I see it, it's literally when farmers or employers do not have another choice. Like they don't really want to be, getting people from another country. They wish they could just find people here, but it's just not possible.
Yeah, and just to add to that point, I mean, the government data shows us that applications for both H-2A and H-2B visas by employers have gone up significantly every year since 2017, 2018. So like you mentioned, Lydia, the demand to bring in workers from overseas is certainly there. Eric, I know I'm hogging our guests with questions. I'll pass it off to you.
All good, all good. So Lydia and Gideon wanted to shift a little bit to the other visa. Wanted to ask both of you about, which is the H-2B, which a couple of minutes ago, and as both of you know, is different than the H-2A in that the H-2B, it's the temporary non-agricultural workers. So I guess Lydia, from bird's eye view, what type of work, what type of employers, what type of industries utilize the H-2B visa?
So I would say a lot of it, for example, is seasonal. So you would have landscapers is I think one of our biggest H2Bs. But really anything where you can prove that you have a peak season would probably be eligible, and that would just mean less than a year. I would say like 10 months or less, right, Gideon, is more or
Yeah,
less
usually
what.
usually usually 9 months for the H-2Bs. Either like Lydia said, a seasonal or a peak load, meaning you have a higher period of employment during, say, the summer months. For instance, Finn being up in Maine, you guys have a huge seafood industry up there, but it's only busy. So busy during specific times of the year, whereas Florida landscaping, they might be busy year round because they have the opportunity for it.
But we see hospitality, we see construction, we see food processing, we see a little bit of pretty much everything.
And the uh, what other we have these important differences between the H-2A, the H-2B. Are there any similarities that people may not know about between the two?
So as far as both the programs go, they are diverse in their own respects because, again, you talk about agricultural. So, for instance, with the agricultural side of the house, the employer is responsible for just about everything. They have to furnish housing, they have to provide meals to the workers, the transportation. But the same thing goes for the H-2B program, where in the basically the context and the legalities of the program, both sides of the house have to provide transportation for the worker from basically their home to the work site once they're approved for their visa and back again. They have to provide a 3/4 guarantee, which means that they have to pay, if the contract is 9 months long, they have to pay 3/4 of that job through that 9 month period. Say, for instance, if they're in an area of the world, let's talk about Vermont with all the rain and flooding they have. So if they're up there working in that area and they're not able to be offered the full amount of hours because of the weather, those workers are still guaranteed 3/4 of that wage. And then on top of that, there's other similarities where, because this program was defined by regulations, the workers are protected in a lot of respects because the employers have to have workman's comp insurance, they have to have, meet OSHA standards for housing and provide safe work sites, basically safety materials for those workers. So there's a lot of components to both sides of the programs that match up. It's just once you dive into them a little bit more, one is, of course, covering agriculture, while the other is anything but. So outside of that, I mean, you'll see a lot of similarities between the programs when you get down to the regulations, outside of just small nuances that each of them have of their own.
And then, like Gideon said, with H-2A, you have to provide housing. With H-2B, you don't. But we always tell employers and that, you have these people that are going to come up that don't speak English, they don't have credit, they don't know the area. Like the humane and the thing that you have to set them up for success. So you do have to help them find housing, and you do have to figure out how they're going to get to work. Like you do kind of have to think ahead, and like these are guest workers. So you need to treat them as such. And that's just, I think, something to keep in mind.
Hey, Gideon, I think there's some noise coming from your
Yeah.
side. You should. There's on your screen. You should be able to see a unmute button. So feel free to just utilize that, and then perfect. No, definitely. Thank you for breaking down some of those similarities. So Lydia and Gideon, want to move on to talking more about Labormex and kind of holistically the H-2A and H-2B visa process. So I mean, starting with Labormex, Lydia, can you just tell us a little bit more about your organization, the history of it, and when you were founded, and any other fun facts?
Sure. My dad and I started Labormex in about 2004. As I mentioned, we've been lucky enough to live both in the U.S. and Mexico. My father was retired, living on a ranch in Mexico when he started it. He had a rice mill. Kind of, they figured out that there's this gringo living in Mexico and that he could probably find them workers. And they contacted him, and he did. He was so happy to do so because he just saw that there were so many hardworking people around him that would love this opportunity to go to the U.S., save money, and come back. And so he did that for a few years until one day, it kind of dawned on him. He's like, Lydia, we could start a business. Like, let's do this. And I was working hospitality, completely different industry, and he convinced me, and I was like, all right, well, we're gonna have to do this. And then little by little, we started off maybe recruiting about 10 workers. And right now we're at a point where we're facilitating recruiting about 30,000 workers a year. So,
That's tremendous growth. So yeah, no, that's
yeah.
awesome. How is that, and growing the company, and starting from idea to where you guys are now? How's that entire journey? What's it been like?
I mean, we've seen the way the industry, the way everything's changed. I mean, I remember in the very beginning, we were filling out DS-160 consulate forms by hand outside at the consulate, right? And little by little, starting to integrate a little bit of more technology and building a database. And COVID was actually one of it really changed the way that we processed workers in a sense, because what we used to have to rely on doing a lot in person, now we're able to do remotely. It forced us to do
Mhm.
things remotely, right? Which I think in a lot of ways has been great in terms of our process. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit it's weird to think about COVID and the entire pandemic, and we're moving further away from it, thankfully, but it brought about changes that I think a lot of us on this call were had been thinking about before the pandemic, and it took a pandemic to like bring about those changes. And it's kind of this weird thing to think about, where it's like outside it's not great, but then these changes are happening, and you're like, these changes are great.
Yeah.
So Labormex, Lydia, what can you break down the maybe go into a little bit more detail about the services that your organization provides?
So we're a recruiter and facilitator only. So that means that, employers still have to file, and they have to go through this lengthy process of getting certified in order to hire H-2A and H-2B workers. You basically have to be given permission, right, by the US to hire these foreign workers. And to do so, we always tell, our clients to use an immigration attorney or agency or somebody with experience, because it is really tedious, and Gideon knows that as well. But once you have your certification, once you've been approved by USCIS, and the government says yes, you're qualified, you can definitely hire these workers, then we take care of the rest. So anything that happens south of the border, whether you need recruiting services, I will say that 80% of our clients don't need recruiting. What they do is they give us a list of, we call them preferred workers. So, let's say, you have a farm and you have, a crew leader and he has family and he has people that he wants to bring over. We're happy to receive that list and then, interview them, vet them, signal if there's any red flags. The only thing that's, we definitely mention is just be careful with prohibited fees. We cannot charge anything. Nobody can charge anything to the workers for these opportunities, and that's something that we take very seriously. So if an employer is going to do their own sort of recruiting, or he's going to rely on somebody from his team to do so, make sure that they know that it's illegal to charge fees to these workers.
So Gideon, quick question. Lydia mentioned that before an employer can bring workers over on one of these visas, they need to get approved by the government. What does that process look like from the employer's perspective?
So at a first glance, it definitely can be daunting. So the first element to that is proving that you have a seasonal need or a peak load, a temporary need. And again, we're talking with both these H-2, H-2B visa programs, you're talking about unskilled workers. So these aren't workers that have degrees, they're not workers that are in a specific field that have technical certificates. They're literally unskilled workers looking to fill these positions. So from the start, basically an employer would work with maybe someone like Envoy. They would basically be walked through the process of how to file their temporary labor certification through the U.S. Department of Labor. So the first step in that, of course, would be getting any necessary documentation to the supporting agent or attorney, and then submitting their petition. For the H-2A, the petitions actually start about 75 days out from their requested start date, whereas the H-2Bs, they file 90 days out, but a lot of times with the H-2B program, because of how difficult it is, it actually starts much sooner. Usually a lot of the attorneys and agents are starting 6 months before the requested start dates because they have to request what's called a prevailing wage. So anywhere that the employer is going to be working, they submit this prevailing wage request, and the Department of Labor says, based on the job code you're requesting, your wage rate's going to be this for that period of employment. And it gets really challenging because the forestry industry works on itineraries. So they might work across 7 or 8 states, but they'll cover multiple areas of employment. So they might have 100, 200 different locations where they have different wages. So that process does take time to get started. So again, if it's H-2A, usually 75, 90 days prior to the start date, they can kick things off, and it's a relatively smooth process. The H-2B definitely requires a lot more involvement, a lot more evidence, and a lot more forward thinking. So it's not something you can just walk into and raise your hand and say, hey, I need some workers from Mexico to come help my landscaping business. It actually does take quite a bit of planning. And again, that's where companies like Envoy are essential, because you guys will help walk the client through exactly what is needed to get them through the program, at least that first time around.
Yeah. So I guess just hypothetically speaking, if we're talking like 90 days in advance, landscaping, I feel like that landscaping season starts to pick up April. So hypothetically, then employers should start thinking about that maybe like the winter of the prior year, is what you're saying?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because again, once you factor in those prevailing wage requests, those are taking anywhere from 60 to 90 days to process right now. When I was working for the former agency that I was with, we basically started our April 1st petitions. We were kicking those off usually in August. Because essentially what was going on, an element to this that I guess we could have talked about, was the H-2A program doesn't have a cap of how many workers can come in annually. There's no cap on that program, whereas the H-2B, there is a fiscal year cap. There's 33,000 workers for the first half, which goes from basically October 1st through the end of March, and then another 33,000 workers come in April 1st through the end of September. So just in the last year alone, they've well exceeded those numbers. So there's a big fight to get into the H-2B program, and there's an actual lottery system that the Department of Labor has had to implement over the last few years in order to be fair to employers and give each employer the opportunity to get their workforce. So yeah, if you're filing an H-2B petition, if you decided to come to a company today and ask for workers, you're looking at next season. I mean, just realistically, you're not going to have an opportunity right now, especially if you're looking for like an April start date. You're really looking to the next year to plan for that.
Got it. So yeah, no, I mean, Lydia, thank you so much for bringing up the lottery and the cap aspect. It's Lydia. What do you think it says about the demand for labor that the H-2B has a cap in the lottery, and then you look at it's not an exact one-to-one counterpart, but the other big visa in the H category, the H-1B, which, as we all know, receives more registrations than there are actual visas available. So now we have these two visas where the demand is so high. I just would love to hear your thoughts on what that says about the labor, the demand for labor.
Yeah, I was just reading that like just H2B alone for the October cap, um, I think it's 35% higher than last year. So I mean that's huge. And it used to, H2B when we first started wasn't that popular, and it really was just sort of landscapers and now we're getting these big corporate names that are like big manufacturers that are like, we really need workers. Like we can't function without them. So yeah, I mean, definitely we need a solution. And one of the things that they've been working on is bringing in people from the Northern Triangle. So they carved out. They said, okay, 33,000, but now we're going to add more as long as you recruit from Guatemala, Honduras, or El Salvador. Gideon, do you remember how many they added from the Northern
Yeah,
Triangle?
they did for this season. They did 20,000 workers from those three countries, so they really opened up a huge addition to that original cap.
So we're trying to expand to those countries and start to facilitate and recruit from there as well. But like with anything, they're new to the program, so there's a lot of hiccups and it's a slower process. Mexico, we've been doing this for such a long time, and the consulates, the embassies are used to it. They're used to the volume of, but in those countries, it's going to take a little bit to work out all the kinks.
Definitely, definitely. I'm going to turn it back to Finn for some additional questions on the H2 program.
Yeah, I mean, this conversation's so fascinating to hear kind of behind the scenes mechanics of both programs. I think one thing that is always interesting to me is how your average American is interacting with immigrants who come over on these types of programs. I mean, I used to live near Oxnard County, right in Southern California, so it's pretty much all guest workers who are in that community working the farms there. Obviously, very fruitful farms in that part of the country. Up in Maine, where I live now, the H-2B program is the lifeblood of the tourism economy up here, right? Bed and breakfasts need it, restaurants need it, especially with the decline in teenage workers over the past few years, where 14, 15-year-olds used to go and work those entry-level jobs a lot more than they do now. Um, what in your several decades of experience working with these immigrants and working with employers that hire these workers, what are some of the biggest misconceptions you've noticed about the H2A or H2B program when you're just talking to folks who maybe aren't as clued in to the reasoning behind why employers need to utilize these programs?
I think the biggest one is that they're taking American jobs. Like you know, I, they're not, and the thing is too, these employers are and these workers are doing everything legally. They've already worked with several government agencies that they've proven the fact that they can't find workers. I mean, they're going out of their way. They're like, guys, this is last resort. It's either I find workers or I have to shut my business down. I have to close my doors. So I think that's the biggest. And the same thing, I've heard stories of the treatment of workers. Like a lot of times, you only hear in the press kind of the bad circumstances, the bad apples. But I can't tell you how many thousands of incredible stories I've had of workers that have saved money, gone home and put their kids through college, opened up a little business, went from having a dirt floor to being able to actually have like a cement floor, buying a little parcel of land and cattle. I mean, it's thousands. We actually like to highlight those in our Facebook experiences and LinkedIn a little bit. But it really is a win-win. I think it's an incredible program.
Gideon, do you agree, or anything else to add?
No, I mean, absolutely. So when I was filing petitions for the previous company I was with, the one thing that has changed a little bit since then in the the program requirements. But basically, employers, when they get to the point where they're hiring these workers, they have to prove without a doubt that they don't have, U.S. employers that are going to step into these jobs. So they're hiring through the state workforce agency, through Department of Labor. When Department of Labor says, all right, you've got your notice of acceptance, now you've got to start your recruitment process. Well, they'd have to put an ad in the local newspaper with the highest area of circulation. So imagine being a client out of like Denver, where your biggest newspaper is the Denver Post, and that ad costs $4,000 for a Sunday run. So all of a sudden, this employer is paying some significant money to post these advertisements to try and get basically U.S. based workers, and any U.S. workers that they hire take away from the number of requested workers they'll actually get certified. So, at the end of the day, employers are like, hey, if I can find workers, I'm more than happy to hire them. But at the end of the day, we saw that a lot of the recruitment efforts just kind of fell on the face, regardless if the state workforce agency was open, regardless how well the employer posted on Facebook, LinkedIn. It didn't matter, just people didn't want to do these jobs. And so the big misconception is, yes, like Lydia said, they're not taking away from the jobs. They're really adding to the economy, because what they're doing is now they're keeping these farms fully employed. They're keeping these businesses fully employed, whereas before they weren't. And so these businesses can keep providing services, especially if you look at H-2B, the highest use of the program is landscaping. So I think this last year there was over 70,000 workers certified for landscaping. Imagine if those workers just stepped out of that field and no longer could provide those services, how many businesses would be out. But imagine how many people would now not have those services to have their yards taken care of. Where would they turn to? I mean, who's going to step up and take on those responsibilities? Yeah, it might sprout a few extra companies here and there, but for the most part, with this program where it's at, these workers are really providing extra service to our country that a lot of people just don't realize. It's a huge benefit to us as the U.S. citizens to be able to have this guest worker program to facilitate those jobs that people just don't want to do.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because if you pay attention to the government data, I mean the areas with the biggest labor shortages are always in agriculture, forestry, hospitality. It's all these areas that that these programs are supposed to fill the gaps for. Yeah, just more of a hypothetical, high level question, but if there's somebody who's listening who maybe runs a company or isn't in communication with folks who run a company that may benefit from hiring workers on these programs, what would be the first steps for an employer who's interested in exploring maybe bringing over an H-2A or H-2B worker on that program? What would be their first steps into exploring that?
I would say get a hold of an immigration attorney or agency or somebody such as Envoy. And like Gideon says, plan ahead, probably a year ahead, especially with H-2B. With H-2A, there's a little bit of more flexibility. But that's a very good place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. I would add to that too. I mean, really just get involved in the program, do your research, understand. I mean, the regulations are not difficult when it comes to whether it's H-2A or H-2B. I mean, they're pretty straightforward as far as the requirements of the program. So really just investing a little bit of time figuring out if it's a good fit for your company, because there are going to be companies where it doesn't make sense financially. You're just looking for one worker, and it's a lot of money just to pursue one worker. But if your company needs, half a dozen workers, those are elements that will really have a big impact, because say you get into the program, you start utilizing the program, you find that it's a good fit for you. Guess what? Now you can bring those workers year after year. If you get a great crew, we see guys coming back year after year, 20, 30 years to the same farms, the same companies. They've grown relationships with those employers, and it's a beautiful thing to see, and it's a great opportunity to also see how well these businesses have grown because of this program as well. So I would say, to your point, Finn, just start doing some research, figure out a good company, figure out a good recruiter facilitator that makes sense, and then go from there.
So Lydia and Gideon, have a couple of to finish, maybe like hypothetical, but maybe some more broader pictures or questions, if you will. Earlier, Lydia, we touched on like the demand for labor, but I'm just curious to hear both of your opinions on we every day in the news we just keep seeing these articles of the unemployment rates at an all-time low. I think it's like 3.6% now. Millions of job openings, So I'm just curious to hear both of your thoughts on how the H2 program, how do you see this fitting in to help employers find workers, to help keep the economy churning, and things of that sort. Gideon, start with you.
Yeah, I mean, with that being said, Eric, so yeah, the economy being at a great point as far as low unemployment, that's fantastic. But it poses the challenge of, okay, for those individuals that are looking for work, where are they going to look for it? I mean, yeah, there's a lot of jobs open, but we look at it now, it's like, do you need to have a degree? Do you not need a degree? Do you need technical certificates? What type of jobs are available? And again, you look at the workforce, there's a lot of people working from home now. There's a lot of people that want jobs that are comfortable, whether in tech or inside. And so, again, that really opens the door to the agricultural side. I think just last year alone, there was almost an increase of over 100,000 workers in the H-2A program from the previous years. I mean, that's a massive increase of numbers of one, maybe new businesses, new agricultural opportunities that opened up, but also people that are not filling those jobs anymore. So this H-2A program especially is going to continue to grow. The H-2B, I think, will as well, but it really opens the doors to numerous job opportunities, whether it's U.S. based or through foreign workers. And it just comes down to if there's a need for it, the H-2 program is a great fit to help fill those temporary labor shortages. It's not a permanent fix for those employers. It is just a temporary seasonal gig to help get those employers through their seasons, and they can use their full-time staff to maintain them through the falls and winters before they repeat and start again. So.
Yeah, I think it's a great solution to do things legally. I think H-2B, if we could just get rid of the cap or increase it, yeah, that would be incredible.
Well, that's actually a perfect segue to my next question. A recent article from a Bloomberg reporter came out earlier this week. Said that the H-2A and H-2B programs are under White House review for overhaul. So I guess at least the question, Lydia, like if you could change anything about the H-2A and H-2B programs, what would you change and why?
Honestly, I'm mostly with H-2B, honestly, and it does go back to the cap. I think it's just really limited, and it's really sad. Like, Finn says, you have people in Maine that it's completely seasonal, right? And what if every year you depend on these H-2B workers to come in, but then one year you don't make the cap? So all your planning, everything that you prepped for, then all of a sudden you don't have the workers. So what do you do? Like, that definitely has to change. Like, there has to be another solution for sure. And just in terms of the program, it's so regulated. I just wish it wasn't as regulated. I see the employers hustle, and they're trying to do things right, but the government never gives them the benefit of the doubt. So yeah, I don't know. What do you think, Gideon?
I agree. I mean, that was the biggest struggle when I was filing the H-2B petitions was the cap. There was always the fight of, are we going to get our employers in, or are they going to be stuck? And we have to wait for Congress to open up additional cap space, which, of course, that took time and always impacted, employers, especially when your start date's April 1st and 2 months have gone by and Congress is still deliberating on whether or not they're going to open up the door for additional workforce. And it's like, these are your U.S. based companies. They need your help now. And it was always this long drawn out fight, lots of fly-ins to DC, lots of conversations, a lot of money spent. Employers would spend time making videos of how their business was being impacted because of the need for these workers. So I would definitely agree that the H2B program in and of itself needs an overhaul as far as the cap space there. The H2A honestly is a great program. There's a lot of essential components that make it really functional. One of the things that has been talked about in some of the recent conversations I've had with other folks is they would love to see it fall under, instead of U.S. Department of Labor, fall under the Department of Agricultural, because they have a much better feel for what is needed for those farms and those growers and what elements they face on a regular basis, whereas Department of Labor is looking at more statistics, and they don't really understand the fundamentals of what helps a farm or agricultural business grow. So I would agree with that conversation, that changing who's in charge of the H-2A program would definitely benefit them long term.
That's a great point. Actually, it never even crossed my mind. It's a great suggestion, Gideon. Well, Lydia, Gideon, I think that brings us to our final, just a couple final questions. And just Lydia and Gideon, anything that we've missed throughout our conversation? Anything else that you would like our listeners to know about the H2A, H2B?
Not that I can think of. One of the things that is always, it's dairy industry, and I think the poultry industry, that they unfortunately they don't fit into the H2B because they're not considered seasonal. But those are industries I think that we definitely have to take a look at, and they're in dire need of workers too, and I don't know, figure out a way for the H2B or the H2A to help them as well.
Got it. And how can if any listeners are looking to utilize one of these visas, how can they get in contact with Labormex to start the process and learn more?
They can certainly email us at info@labormex.com, and we can call them up and explain the process in detail for sure.
Nice, nice. And then finally, just putting the spotlight on both of you and Labormex. Anything coming up? Any events or anything of that sort that you guys want to highlight?
So within Labormex, not specifically. So we, as part of the H2 program, there's always things going on throughout the country. So the Seasonal Employment Alliance, they're coming actually to my hometown, Coeur d'Alene, in August. They're going to be talking about some basically updates for the H2B program, things they're looking to legislate just to help improve the program. Same thing with the H2A. There's the National Council for Agricultural Employees. They host a ag forum, and this one's going to be, I think, at the end of it's November 29th. It's going to be out in Las Vegas. So a lot of the big agricultural entities that are in the H2A program, legal entities, they'll all be part of that conversation. We're going to attend as well. I think we'll have a little bit of a presentation spot there in that forum to be able to talk a little bit more about some things that are happening in the world. But it's a great opportunity if you've never been part of the program and you want to come to a really cool event and just see what's involved, talk to other employers that are in the program, talk to some attorneys and what they see on a daily basis. That's a really neat opportunity. And again, that's through the NCAE, and it's happening in November in Las Vegas.
And we're really lucky that we're very busy now most of the year. So we always invite employers, if they ever want to come to Mexico and actually observe a consulate process. Our doors are open. The same thing, we do hold job fairs sometimes in Mexico. And we always tell employers, like, please come, please, help us interview the workers, meet them, greet them. So yeah, anybody who wants to get involved, they're more than welcome to.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, really appreciate both of you sharing those details. Sounds like some fun events coming up. So yeah, we'll share those details. Well, Lydia and Gideon, it's been a pleasure speaking with both of you today about Labormex, the H2A, and the H2B. Definitely learned a lot, and hope and I think our listeners will learn a lot too if they're a little bit unfamiliar with these visa programs. So thank you so much for hopping on the show today.
Great. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, I appreciate it, guys.
All right, take care. We'll see you shortly.